Welcome to achieving epic results for your architectural interior real-time projects. My name is Matthew Doyle, and I'll be your instructor. I've worked in both the architectural and entertainment industries for nearly 2 decades, creating real-time interactive experiences in both real-world and fantasy environments, most often using the Unreal Engine. I also worked at Autodesk for 7 years, teaching content creators how to use 3D tools. This course will show you the power of Unreal Studio to create photorealistic architectural interiors. I welcome you to follow me throughout the course as we cover everything you'll need from start to finish to create a highly performant and visually stunning architectural interior in Unreal Studio. The workflow we'll cover starts in 3ds Max with a completed architectural scene, provided courtesy of TurboSquid. While the course uses 3ds Max assets, you can easily apply all the concepts to any other 3D tool. Most of the work will be done in Unreal Studio, where we'll cover the requirements for creating photorealistic lighting, post-processing effects such as real-time light bloom and depth of field, adding interactivity to your scene using blueprints, and finally, debugging and distributing your walkthroughs. Before we get started, let's discuss some of the things you'll need to be able to follow along. See you there. To follow along with the course, you'll want to have an architectural interior scene similar to the one I'll be using here. This scene was built in 3ds Max and makes use of V-Ray materials, but you could just as easily use a scene from Maya or Blender, and you could also opt for standard materials. The scene doesn't need to be overly complicated, but should include a few pieces of furniture, some windows, and some basic materials including reflective and transparent materials if you want to be able to follow along. A great example scene you could use is also found in the Unreal library under Learn. If we just click on Learn and then scroll down a little bit and look for the realistic rendering scene, you'll find this is a great example of an architectural interior that has photorealistic rendering. You can always load this up into Unreal and work with this scene if you want to follow along, if you don't have a scene of your own. You should also already be very comfortable creating 3D content and should understand all of the basic operations within Unreal Studio. If you aren't yet comfortable with Unreal, I advise you to stop this course now and instead go through some of the basic Unreal tutorials on using the interface. If you have the basics down, you should be fine. I'll be touching on data preparation in this course briefly, but for a much more detailed walkthrough on preparing your assets for Unreal Studio, be sure to check out my course on data preparation. It goes into a lot of depth on all the different types of assets you'll be sending over into Unreal Studio and some of the preparation you'll need for those assets. For additional help beyond this course, be sure to visit the Unreal Launcher, click on Learn, and at the very top you'll find links to the documentation as well as the Unreal YouTube channel and of course the Unreal Wiki. These resources provide a vast knowledge base on using Unreal. And while a lot of it is geared towards creating games, many of the subjects still apply to architectural workflows. Next up, we'll take a quick look at the scene we'll be using and enumerate some common items that should be dealt with before sending your scene to Unreal Studio. Throughout the course, we'll be using the scene I have loaded up in 3ds Max 2018, again courtesy of TurboSquid. This particular scene is composed of a few hundred objects and just over 1.8 million polygons, or roughly 3.5 million triangles. All the materials being used are V-Ray materials, which is a very popular renderer in architectural visualization, in case you didn't know that. The good news is that Unreal Studio, by way of the Datasmith exporter, fully supports V-Ray materials. The scene also uses several lights, including some V-Ray lights. So if we do a quick search here for V-Ray, we've got a V-Ray sunlight. The scene also uses some photometric lights that have IES profiles assigned to them. And the good news is that, once again, Unreal Studio supports these as well when we export them. You'll be able to use any similar architectural interior and easily be able to follow along. Let's look at a couple of things you'll want to look at, though, before proceeding. Your scene in the 3D tool should be set to the same world scale as Unreal Studio. In 3ds Max, that's easily done by going to Customize, Unit Setup, and then System Unit Setup, and we can see here that 1 unit equals 1 centimeter here. Unreal Studio's basic working unit is a centimeter, so if you're working in anything other than centimeters, you're going to need to do some conversions. Now, the best workflow is to work in centimeters from the beginning, but fear not, there are ways to convert your scene to match Unreal in most 3D packages. And we'll get into how to do that in a little more depth coming up. Also, you may notice that while the scene's assets do have good names for the most part, they could be a little better. We'll get some basic naming conventions for each type of asset, including geometry, materials, and textures. Now, you may also notice in this particular scene, many of these assets are grouped together. So you can see here, when I selected one object back here, I'm basically getting all the objects that are on the countertop. This is fine, and Unreal will respect layers and grouping in 3ds Max. But you'll want to make sure that your assets are cohesive actors, such as a full table or a full teapot here. You don't want them to be constituent parts like the teapot handle and the teapot spout, because that is going to create kind of a mess in Unreal, because each of these parts will come in as separate assets. So while you can work that way, Unreal will import those assets. It's just better if you want to be able to move them around later to make sure that they are entire actors, not just their constituent parts. Grouping objects, however, is fine. What Unreal will do when we export these assets is each of these assets will be its own static mesh in the content folder that you can drag into the scene. But the ones that are already in the scene will be grouped as they are here in 3ds Max. So now that we've had a look at the course assets and what we're going to be working with, let's go ahead and get right into preparing these assets for export into Unreal Studio. Getting your assets into Unreal Studio really doesn't require a lot of preparation. Unreal is very forgiving of the assets it will import. They can have poor naming conventions, unoptimized geometry, and incorrect world scale, and Unreal will bring them in without skipping a beat. But it's generally a best practice to spend a little time cleaning your scene up before sending it to Unreal Studio to help avoid any potential problems later in the process. For example, using the wrong world scale and unit size can lead to all kinds of issues related to baked lighting and viewer movement around the scene. So getting that set up so that your 3D scene matches the scene scale of Unreal is important. Let's look at that in 3ds Max again. First of all, here under Customize, if we go to Unit Setup, bear in mind that the display unit scale has nothing to do with the actual world scale. This is just what it displays things as. But if we go to System Unit Setup, we'll see here that we're set to 1 unit equals 1 centimeter, and that's what we want to be. If you have a scene that's in feet and inches or some other scale, you're going to need to convert it. And that's why it's better to start out from the very beginning using the centimeter scale. Now in 3ds Max, if you need to change the unit scale to match Unreal after the fact, one option is to go to your utility panel here and look for Rescale World Units. You'll probably have to use the More button. Mine's just been added here. But inside the utilities here, you will find Rescale World Units. And using Rescale World Units, if we click Rescale, we can come in here and change the scale factor. Now to go from feet and inches, I believe the scale factor is 2.5 or 250%. By doing that, this will rescale everything to the proper size. But after you've done that, always remember in 3ds Max to reset the transform. That's also going to be found under your Utilities panel. Simply select each of your objects and choose Reset X Form, and then Reset Selected. And then under the modifiers, you'll of course want to collapse the stack on that object. Now let me show you what happens if you don't reset the transform in 3ds Max. In Unreal Studio, I have a version of the scene I've already exported ahead of time, and you're going to see a lot of little white spheres around the level here. And that means that a lot of these assets did not come in as static mesh actors. Now, static mesh actors are basically anything like furniture and walls, all of the static objects in your scene. These instead have come in as just plain actors, and the reason for that is that their transforms have not been properly reset, so there's some errors with the transform data of these objects, so they didn't come in as static mesh actors. For instance, this coffee table here, this one did come in as a static mesh actor, so that one's okay. But if we look at these chairs, we can see that these are just plain actors. So here in 3ds Max, we want to select the chairs, reset the transform, and then we can re-export these chairs back into Unreal, and this should solve our problem of these being actors versus static meshes. Let's go ahead and export this chair. Now also bear in mind that Unreal Studio does support instances, so if you have a bunch of chairs that are all the same, Instead of having them come in as different objects, as individual assets in Unreal, you can have one and then clone it, and then when it exports, that one asset will be brought into the content browser. So you'll only have one copy of the chair. Then that chair will be duplicated or cloned throughout the scene by Unreal Studio where it's needed. Now, we haven't gotten to exporting our assets yet. We will be getting to that shortly. But in the meantime, when you're preparing your assets for export, after you've actually used the exporter, whether it's FBX or Datasmith, this happens to be the Datasmith window for output warnings. You can check this window to find out if there are still issues with your assets. Now we're going to skip over the first few here that have to do with materials. We're going to talk about that coming up shortly. But these invalid transforms here, this is going to give you a good idea as to whether or not these assets in this list are going to come in properly in Unreal Studio, whether they'll be static mesh actors or just actors. So if you want to make sure your assets are all coming in as static mesh actors, just make sure that there's nothing under this invalid transforms list. So now that we've re-exported the chairs and table into our scene, we can see we no longer see those little white spheres. They're essentially the locations of the pivot points on those actors, but these are all now static mesh actors. So these are all set up nicely the way we want them to be. And they're actually all, these chairs are instances of this first chair. So if I were to go ahead and right-click it and choose Browse to Asset, that's the chair in the content browser. It's labeled as 273973. That's how Datasmith names all the assets when you import them. If I were to select the chair next to it and then browse to asset, or I could just look here where it says edit 273973, obviously it's the same asset. So we're taking advantage of instancing there. Now, as for the other pivot points for the groups, which you can't change, they're not going to be static mesh actors, you could go through the list here and just manually hide them. So for the table objects, I could just hit this eyeball here and that will hide the pivot point for that. Or you could go up to this show button in the viewport, go down to sprites, and then uncheck miscellaneous. And that will hide all of those actor pivot points for all the different groups in your scene, give you a nice viewport to work with. Now, naming conventions will help keep your scene and assets organized in both the 3D tool and Unreal Studio. Again, the names of this scene aren't terrible, but they could be better. You can use whatever naming convention system that you prefer to use, whichever one you're comfortable with, and it will work in Unreal Studio if you follow some basic rules. For one, never use special characters like number signs, and avoid using spaces. Preferably, you want to always stick to alphanumeric characters, and then you can use underscores for spaces. Unreal recommends some common naming conventions for the basic assets like geometry, materials, and textures. For a static mesh actor such as this chair, we could keep it as Bombay Chair 01, and it's got an underscore there for a space. But if you want to use the basic Unreal naming conventions, that would be SM for static mesh, underscore, then we can do Bombay Chair, and then we could do 01. Let's look at some material naming conventions here as well. So we'll bring up the material editor. In this case, we have two materials here. We'll go ahead and select the first one. So we can see on this material, it's labeled tap space chrome. So again, we're violating the rule here of having a space in the name. So what we're going to do is we're going to start the material name with the letter M for material, underscore, tap, and then underscore chrome. And then if we want to, if we know we're going to use this material multiple times with some differences, we'll put a 01 at the end. But in this case, I know we're only using it once, so that should be fine. Likewise, the next material down here is labeled tap hose. So we'll change that to M for material underscore tap underscore hose. Now you don't have to use an underscore. You could group everything together without underscores, but it does help to separate the words out, make it a little bit easier to read. Another technique would be to use camel case. So we've got tap and then we'll capitalize the H in hose. And that's what they call camel case in programming language. It's another technique for visually separating the words. Now, last of all, we need to look at the pivot points of our objects. Now, Unreal Studio uses a Z-up coordinate system, and they recommend that you have the X-axis as the forward part of all of your assets. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with pivots is that generally you want to put them in a place that is centered on the mesh and usually at the bottom of the geometry. That way you can use it for snapping in Unreal Studio. So if we go again to Effect Pivot, and it will just drag it down essentially to the floor. where it makes contact with the floor. And of course, I'm just kind of eyeballing it here, but you'll want to go into your different views and make sure it looks right. And then center it on the object. So we'll go ahead and redrag that down to the floor after we've centered it. And the point of this, again, is that when you're dragging it around in Unreal Studio, you'll be able to snap it to the ground. So this is a summary of the more important things you'll need to do to prepare your assets for export into Unreal Studio. For a more in-depth coverage of the topic, including more insights into each subject, as well as additional subjects, such as LOD creation, which is technically more applicable to exterior scenes, be sure to watch my course on data preparation. And I go into a great bit of detail on each topic, including more information on things like pivot points and naming conventions and whatnot. And you'll get a better grasp of some of the things you can do to help organize your scene and get your data prepared, get all your assets ready for export into Unreal Studio. So up next, we're going to take a look at the materials supported by Unreal and discuss some of the things you'll need to ensure to make sure your materials look the same in both your 3D tool and in Unreal Studio. Unreal Studio supports the majority of standard materials when exporting with FBX, so that would include Phong, Blend, all your basic surface shaders. Now, when exporting with Datasmith, you can also export V-Ray materials. Now, what Unreal does with materials on export is to automatically convert them to Unreal's own physically based material system. If you're not familiar with physical materials, they're just a different algorithm that uses more artist-friendly ways to create pretty much any material type you can imagine. So rather than your typical specular and gloss inputs, so if I go ahead and bring up my material browser here, on this V-Ray material, it's basically a chrome material for the sink. Rather than having things like reflection gloss and so forth, specularity, things like that, the physical material makes use of metallic and roughness among some other inputs. Let's jump over to Unreal and have a quick look at that. And we can see here we have obviously our base color, that would be our diffuse, but then we have metallic and then roughness, and these are going to control the reflectivity of that material. Okay, so if we want to add a metallic look, a chrome look to our sink, we'll just drag off of the metallic input there and then open constants and choose the first one there, constant. So this gives us a scalar value. Now, when you're doing metallic objects, it's best to just either be completely metallic or not metallic at all. So it's 1 or 0 in this case. So we'll set it to 1. And that's going to give us a nice high sheen look there. Now, in order for our roughness, we can see it's a very glossy look. That means it's very rough. It's diffusing the light. We need to bring that down. So we'll go ahead and pull off a roughness. We'll put another constant. And we'll just leave it at 0. Or we might raise it up a little bit. We'll put it at about 0.02. And that gives us a nice, high polished metallic chrome. Now you can use image maps here. You can, instead of using a scalar value, we could put a texture value here. That will control, like if you have a metal surface that is partly metal and partly not metal, you know, maybe it's painted over a little bit, we could do that. But in the case of this faucet, I know I want it to look completely chrome. One other thing I wanted to mention about metallic objects, or anything that's reflective, basically. In order for this to work, we're going to be using some reflection techniques, which we'll talk about later on in the course, to reflect the scene on the object. And in order for those to work, we need to make sure that we're making good use of the metallic and roughness parts of the material. So we'll just open that back up again. And in the material here, remember, metallic and roughness, these two control how metallic an object is and how strong the reflections are going to be, or how glossy they might be. So if we tweak our roughness and bring it up to 1, then that is going to be a very little reflection on the object at all. It's going to look very matte because it's so diffuse, it's so rough, and the light is bouncing off it in all directions. So of course we want to keep that low if we want reflectivity on it that we can see. And then likewise metallicness, you want to set that to either, again, 1 for fully metallic or 0 for not metallic. And then of course you can still control that with a texture map as well if you wanted to have parts of the object that weren't metallic. But these two values here, again, metallic and roughness, they're going to control that reflectivity. And we'll talk more about it when we get to that part of the course. Another example of reflectivity in the material can be found on the floor here. It's kind of a waxy reflection here. It looks really nice, and it's reflecting the environment. Again, that's happening because we're using some reflection techniques that we'll talk about later in the course. But if we look at the material, we can see the material component that is required to have that reflectivity. We're not using metallic in this case, so essentially metallic is set to 0. What we are using, however, is roughness. Now, before we were using roughness tied to a scalar value. In this case, this roughness is tied to a texture sample. So you can obviously use a texture to control that reflectivity. And again, remember that this is all basically duplicated for us or converted using Datasmith from a V-Ray material in 3ds Max. So we didn't have to set this up ourselves. This was all done automatically when we imported the asset into Unreal. So you can pretty much duplicate any material that you could create in your 3D tool, whether they're standard-based materials or V-Ray-based materials. And just to remind you, we'll go ahead and open the material editor here again. If you wanted to find nodes that you're familiar with, all you have to do is right-click on a blank space here, and you can either dig through this list or you can simply do a search for something like, say, noise. So there's my noise node, and I can just drop it into the editor here and make use of it. Now, if you're using bump maps in your 3D tool, and chances are you are, so for instance, this apple crate material here, this is using some bump maps for the crate sides and the crate front. Now, it looks like these are set to normal maps already, but you can also use black and white images here for your bump maps. Just bear in mind that when you export them with Datasmith, all of your bump maps, your black and white bump maps, will be converted to normal maps in Unreal Studio. And we can see here we have the normal input where bump would be, and then that normal input is tied into a flattened normal, which is our normal texture there, our bump map texture from 3ds Max. And it does this for you automatically, so you don't have to do anything when you export. Another thing to keep in mind is two-sided materials. So if we look at these lamps here, we can see that they're see-through, they're transparent on one side, and that is because it's making use of a two-sided material. This object is doesn't have any thickness. So normally what I would prefer to do here, rather than use a two-sided material, would be to give this object some thickness so that this sort of situation doesn't occur. Unreal can do two-sided materials. So under materials for the lamp, if we open the first material here and then select the main material node, we can go over to the left here under the details and enable two-sided, and then just save that. And now we can see we have a fully two-sided material there. When working with two-sided materials, you're likely to encounter an issue where one side of the material is properly lit and the other side renders as black when you bake your light maps. To solve that, select the mesh, go into your lighting settings, and select Use Two-Sided Lighting. Next time you bake your light map, you'll have proper lighting on both sides of the two-sided material. So to help you visualize any objects in your scene in the 3D tool that are in fact using a two-sided material, it's best to turn on backface culling. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Object Properties on these lamps and check backface culling. Now I can see anywhere I'm going to have problems. If I obviously want to go through my level and make sure any objects that are flat, thin objects that don't have any thickness to them, I want to turn off backface culling so I can see where I'm going to run into issues when I export into Unreal. Again, Unreal does support two-sided materials. You can enable them, but I prefer, at least if it's not something like cloth, anything really thin like that, I prefer to go ahead and give that object some thickness instead. Now, when you're exporting your scene, it'll help you diagnose any material problems you have. For instance, on the output warnings here, where it says partially supported, we can see that textures of type noise are not supported. And there's a couple of ways that we can fix that. So if we go to that material, I know which one it is. I'll go ahead and open my material editor. It's this tulip material here. And down here on the third submaterial, we have our noise map being applied to our bump map. Now, one way to fix that would be to create our own noise map using Photoshop or something, and then just apply that as a texture instead of a noise map here. But another way would be to jump into Unreal and fix it there. So let's do that. Now, in order to apply a noise generator to our normal channel, we'll first of course need our noise generator. So we'll right click and choose noise. And we're going to need two other nodes. We're going to need a prepare perturb normal HQ and a perturb normal HQ. So we'll right click again and we'll just type, let's see, perturb. There we go. So we've got our prepare perturb normal HQ, and we're going to pipe in our noise into the value there. And then we also need another perturb node. And this time it's the perturb normal HQ. And we're just going to pull these across, match them up. So the first one to the first one, the second one to the second one, and the third one to the third one. And then we can wire this into our normal channel. Of course, if we want to change any of the noise parameters, we just select the noise node here, and under details on the left, we can see we can change all of those settings here. All right, as one last material type, we're going to look at refractive materials, in this case, V-Ray materials that have refraction. So we have a lot of glasses and pictures in our scene here in 3ds Max. We'll go ahead and open the material. This is the glass material that's being used. It's a very simple material, but it does, under reflection and refraction, we do have the index of refraction set. This would be set basically to glass, 1.52. And then for reflection, it's set to 2.3, so we get some nice kind of distorted reflections, Fresnel-based reflections here. And the great news is that Datasmith will export this material into Unreal Studio with very little work required on your part, if any at all, actually. So let's jump over to Unreal and have a quick look at the same material there. It was just exported with Datasmith, and I didn't do anything to change it. In Unreal, we have the same glass picture object, and you can tell it has some refraction on it, so especially there, the distortion of the window. And on the very edges of it, we have some Fresnel refraction going on for the scene. We can adjust this by going into the material editor, so we'll open up this material. And on the material, at the bottom, you have your refraction input node. Let's just slide this over a little bit. And we can go over to the inputs coming into the refraction node. We can see all we really have here is a linear interpolation node that ties back to the Fresnel effect. So if we click on the Fresnel effect, we have two values here. We have this exponent or power value, and then we have this base value. Let's go ahead and open this up a little so you can see the entire word. So we have base, reflect, refraction. Now this value is set at 0.04 right now. This is the one, if we tweak this, we'll get the most effect out of it. So I'm going to set this to, let's just set it to 1, and we'll go ahead and save the material, and we'll wait for the update. All right, so that made a pretty huge impact on the refraction of our glass there. You can see it's distorting everything behind it a lot more significantly now. So working with the Unreal Materials system is quite easy. You're going to find the material editor is just like working with, say, Slate in 3ds Max. It's a visual tool, and the only real difference is with 3ds Max materials, whether you're working with V-Ray or standard materials, those materials are not designed for real time. Those are software materials, and they are used obviously for rendering. Whereas the materials system, all of these nodes and whatnot in Unreal Studio, these are hardware-based materials or shaders, and they run on the video card at runtime. But you can get all of the same basic effects that you can in, say, V-Ray. You can get refraction, reflection, emissive, ambient occlusion, all of that stuff, bump maps, that's all achievable with real-time shaders. And the tool is actually quite easy to use. However, you may not even need to touch the material editor when you export with Datasmith, because Datasmith does a great job of converting all of your standard material types and V-Ray materials into these real-time shaders within Unreal. So there's going to be very little tweaking needed to be done on your part. You may want to come into the material editor anyway and adjust some settings, tweak the metallic factor or the roughness, or play with the refraction or whatnot. And all of that is at your disposal. You have a great deal of nodes in here that you can use to create some really interesting material effects. So it's entirely up to you how you want to work. If you want to get more detailed information on materials and how to work with the material editor, be sure to check out the other Unreal courses and tutorials, as well as the help wiki on using the material editor. There's a ton of great information out there on creating some really compelling stuff. Up next, we'll spend a little time going over some of the export options available to us, including the most important settings when exporting using FBX and the simplicity and speed of Datasmith. We're ready to send our scene over to Unreal Studio and begin the work toward creating our real-time walkthrough. You have a few different options to export here. The two we'll cover are FBX and Datasmith. The differences between the two are pretty stark, but they both ultimately get your asset into Unreal. The real difference is that Datasmith can export your entire scene in one go with just a few clicks, We can send the entire scene to Unreal, including all materials, lights, cameras, and geometry, and even IES profiles. Before we start exporting, however, we need a project to work with, so let's hop into Unreal Studio and set a project up. In the Unreal Launcher, I'll go to my library, and we're going to, rather than choose one of my pre-built projects here, I'm just going to launch the editor. In the Unreal Project Browser, go to New Project, and from here, there's a couple of routes we can take. So first of all, if we click on the Unreal Studio tab, we can create a new blank project. Now, if we do this, our project is automatically set up for Unreal Studio. However, it's not going to have any first-person controls or anything like that, allowing the viewer to be able to move around the level. We'd have to build all those from scratch, and you can certainly do that using blueprints. But in order to save some time, I'm just going to go to the Blueprint tab here and choose the first-person project type. Now, by doing this, we're not going to have the benefit of starting in an Unreal Studio project, but I'll show you how to easily convert your first-person project into one. Okay, so now that our project is set up, we have a default level here with a player in the middle of it, and if we play that, we can see that he can fire a gun, and we can walk around and jump, and of course, we're not going to need any of this in our architectural walkthrough for our viewers. So we'll look into how to get rid of this stuff when we get into the interactivity section. But for now, we know that we have a working system that we can actually walk around in. Now, in order to bring in our Datasmith file, we'll need to create a blank level. So we'll go to File and then just choose New Level, and we'll go with an empty level here. So we'll go to Settings, and then under here, we'll choose Plugins. Just scroll down until you find Unreal Studio. And on the bottom here, we want to hit this button that says Convert, Project, and Restart. So now that the project is converted, if we go back down to Unreal Studio, we can see that all of the plugins are enabled for importing our assets. Now we're first going to look at Datasmith Export. To export the entire scene, we'll just go to our File Export option in the menu. Browse to the location where you want to export, and then under Save as Type, we want to make sure we have Unreal Datasmith selected. I'm just going to overwrite my previous export here, Loft Style Living Room. You can see here in the Datasmith export options, there's really nothing here. We can just decide what we want to export, whether it's the entire scene or visible objects, or our current selection. So I'll leave it as visible objects. And now using the Import Datasmith button at the top here, we can import our assets. So we'll browse to the folder that contains our export, our Datasmith export, and just double click it. And in the import window for Datasmith, we just need to specify what folder we want it to go into. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder under Content, and we'll call it Datasmith Import. In the second window that pops up, this is the Datasmith Import Options window. It's really just a few options here we need to make sure are checked. Obviously, we want to include geometry, materials and textures and lights, and if you were bringing in any cameras, you would check that as well, but in this case, we aren't. We want to open, though, the Show Advanced option here, because under Static Mesh Options, we have the ability to adjust the minimum and maximum light map resolutions. Now, Datasmith and Unreal Studio are going to automatically generate light maps for us, and we'll talk more about light maps when we get into the lighting section of the course. Now, the settings that I recommend here are to set minimum and maximum to the same value of 512. And what this is going to do is it's going to tell Datasmith to maximize the UV coordinate space for your light map UVs. So with the maximum light map size set at 512 by 512, the generator will do its best to take up the entire resolution of the light map with UVs when it flattens out the mesh. Once it finishes importing the scene, you're going to find all of the assets for the scene in your content browser. So if we recall, I chose the Datasmith import folder, and in there you'll find the name of the Datasmith file. So this is Loft Style Living Room. And in there we've got our geometries folder, which contains all of the meshes, the materials folder containing obviously the materials, and the textures folder, which obviously contains the textures. And then we have some IES profiles that were brought in, as well as the actual Datasmith import file. If we ever want to re-import Datasmith, we can right-click and choose Re-import, and that will bring in all of those assets again. If we've made changes and re-exported, we can do that there. Now, when you first bring it in, you're going to see this compiling shaders window at the bottom. Just be patient, let it finish. That's why right now everything looks like a checkerboard pattern. It's still working on creating all of those physically based shaders for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at FBX export options. Now in FBX export options, we can uncheck tangents and binormals. We can uncheck turbo smooth. We can uncheck convert deforming dummies to bones, uncheck triangulate. We don't need any of these. All we really need is preserve edge orientation and smoothing groups. Under animation, we don't generally need this unless we have an object that obviously has some sort of animation built into it, but we're going to go ahead and uncheck that for now. Under cameras, if we're going to export our cameras, we'll need to make sure that this is checked. In this case, we aren't. Obviously under lights, the same thing. We're not exporting any lights in this case, so we'll uncheck that. Now we don't need embed media because as long as this object is using a standard material type, when we export it into Unreal, Unreal will automatically locate the textures for that material and bring them in. Bear in mind, however, that with FBX export, we cannot export V-Ray materials. That will only work when we use Datasmith. Below this, under the advanced options, we have the ability to change the scale factor of our scene for the units. Now, right now it's set to automatic. And in my case, because this scene is using centimeters, we don't have to mess with this. But if you wanted to, you could come in here, disable automatic, and change the scene units converted drop down. So if you were using feet and inches in your scene, you could set this to centimeters. And then when this exports, it would do its best to convert the scene into centimeters. Generally, I do not recommend using this option, so leave this to automatic. It doesn't work very well. The best solution is to go into your 3D tool and convert all of your assets to the proper scale that way. After that, we have axis conversion, and we want to make sure that the axis is set for a Z up axis. That's what Unreal uses. So just make sure this dropdown says Z up. Now we can see here with FBX, we've got some warnings of our material types. I'm exporting an entire group of objects here, so we can see we've got these books and magazines and whatnot. These are using material types that are not supported by FBX. That's because these are V-Ray materials. So when we bring this over into Unreal, the materials will exist. They will have materials, but they won't be able to bring in the textures. Now in Unreal, we just need to hit the Import button, and we'll select our coffee table. So here we have some more options we need to examine. In the FBX import options, we have, first of all, the mesh dropdown, and we want to make sure that skeletal mesh is not checked. A skeletal mesh is going to be more like a character, something that's animated using a skeleton. In this case, we're bringing in a coffee table and some books and whatnot, and none of them have animation on them. So we want them to come in as static meshes. So we want to uncheck skeletal mesh. We can also automatically generate collision, and we'll talk more about that later on in the course. We'll go ahead and leave this checked for now and use this advanced button here to get a little more detail, some more options here on our mesh import. Now, a lot of these options here we're going to skip over because they're not important to an architectural interior, such as this LOD group dropdown. We don't really get a benefit from using LODs in a small confined space, so we won't be talking about that. However, if we look down a little lower, we've got this Generate Lightmap UVs option. We want to make sure that that is checked for us, and that's going to automatically create Lightmap UVs. We'll talk about Lightmap UVs coming up soon, but basically this is going to allow us to get our baked lighting. Below this, we have Transform Vertex to Absolute. Now, with this checked, anything we import is basically going to have its pivot point, its origin, at the origin of the world, at 0, 0, 0. If you don't want that, if you want your assets to use their own pivot points, their own origins, make sure you uncheck Transform Vertex to Absolute. The Convert Scene checkbox, which is enabled by default, will allow us to determine if we want to convert the FBX coordinates to the Unreal Engine coordinate system, which is a left-handed system, and 3ds Max is a right-handed system, so we'll go ahead and make sure that this is checked. We can also choose Force Front X Axis. Now this is going to make sure that the front of all your assets has the X axis pointing towards the front. Then we have Convert Scene Unit. The Convert Scene Unit checkbox will allow you to convert whatever units you're using in the FBX file into the centimeter-based system of Unreal Engine 4. I don't recommend using this option. It's not going to work very well. It's still better just to go into your 3D tool and set up the system to centimeters to begin with. Build your stuff in that centimeter-based system, or at least convert it using the tools available to you in the 3D tool. Under materials, we just want to make sure that import materials and textures are checked. But remember, if your materials are V-Ray based materials or non-standard materials, any material that FBX export does not support, then when you bring them in, the materials are going to be missing the textures. Unreal will not be able to find the textures for them. But if they are standard materials, that won't be a problem. Now that we've got all our data into Unreal Studio, it's time to begin lighting it up. We'll cover lighting in detail throughout the next sections. There are two routes we could take at this point in the project. We could add all the interaction that allows the viewer to walk around and do stuff, or we could begin on the lighting in the scene. Either way works, but I generally like to get the lighting and materials to a good preview level at least before moving on to adding interaction. But before we can even begin to add lighting, we'll need to first make sure all our scene geometry is properly set up to receive lighting. Just like rendering in a 3D tool, Unreal Studio needs to bake high-quality GI or global illumination lighting. Unreal Studio has support for both dynamic and baked lighting, but unfortunately, modern video cards are not yet capable of handling real-time dynamic global illumination. We'll still look at some dynamic lighting techniques in this course later, but for the most part, we're going to be baking our GI lighting directly into the geometry using a separate UV channel. We'll do the baking with Unreal Studio's Light Mask Baker, which is a high-quality GI ray tracing tool. We'll talk about setting it up later. But to bake light maps, you need to have good quality light map UVs. Light map UVs work just the same as diffuse texture UV coordinates, but for baked lights and shadows. The light maps then get multiplied into the diffuse and normal maps. Unreal does a great job of automatically creating light map UVs for most objects, and that can be done automatically on import as we saw in the previous videos. But light map UVs may need to be created manually on some objects, as the automatic generator may have issues with very complex or organic shapes, or any objects that are not exactly optimized. Their geometry might have overlapping faces and whatnot. So let's look at how to work with light maps in Unreal, and then we'll jump into 3ds Max and look at how to manually generate light map UVs. Now, we've already seen that when we import with Datasmith or FBX import, we can automatically generate those light map UVs. So if I were to take this chair here and we'll browse to the asset and let's open it up. In the Mesh Editor, we can use the UV dropdown to have a look at the different UV channels. UV channel 0, that's going to be our diffuse material. We can see that it's basically using projection mapping. In this case, UV channel 2 are going to be our automatically generated light map UVs. Now we can see here that Unreal has done a pretty good job of creating the light mapping UVs. Now there are some basic rules when generating light mapping UVs, whether they're being done automatically or manually. First and foremost, they cannot overlap. Every UV needs to be unique. Unlike diffuse materials where you can have projection mapping and tiling and all of that, all of the UVs need to be packed into the 0 to 1 UV space, and they need to not overlap. If they overlap, you're obviously going to have some light mapping problems when you bake your lights. Another thing you should do is try to get good padding on your light map UVs. In other words, from the edge of the texture, you need to make sure your light map UVs aren't too close, and they shouldn't be too close to other shells. If they are, there can be some light bleeding. So if you have one shell that is in shadow and another shell that's lit up, if they're too close, there might be a chance that those lighting effects can be passed on to the other shell. They can bleed over. So this is tightly packed here, and it might be okay, but it might have some light bleed. But don't worry about it until you've done your light map bake, at least a test bake, to see what it looks like. And if you spot any bleeding, it could be because you have padding issues. Another good thing to look at is seaming. So just like with diffuse materials, when you're generating light map UVs, there are going to be seams, and you don't want those seams to be very noticeable. That you don't want them to be very jagged, things like that, because that can create light map artifacts. So you want to make sure that when you're creating your light map UVs, you do the best you can to hide your seams and keep them as uniform as possible. When you're using an automatic light map generator here, it may create bad seams. So again, bake your light maps first, see what it looks like. If you need to manually go in and redo it, then do so. Otherwise, don't worry about it just yet. Now let's look at some of the settings under the Details panel here. If we scroll down to the LOD0 settings, under Build Settings, we'll find Min Light Map Resolution. This value, generally, you want it to match the actual light map resolution. So that's found under General Settings. Here we have Light Map Resolution. It's set to 512, so we want our minimum light map resolution to match that. Now watch what happens when I drop this down to 256 and hit the Apply Changes button. So we can see here it's repacked the light map UVs. They're pretty much the same, but they're just smaller and they have more spacing. Now, this might be an option if you've got bleed issues. You might want to just lower the minimum light map resolution so everything isn't quite so close. In fact, if we drop this down really low to 32 and then apply our changes, you can see here we've got a lot of padding, but this is not going to be a good light map for us. This is going to be very poor quality. So we're going to just jump right back up to 512. Now, the other thing to take note of here is if you scroll down again to general settings, you'll find light map coordinate index, and this is where you will specify the UV channel where your light map UVs are. So in this case, that would be UV channel 2. So we want to make sure this has a 2 in it. Obviously, if you automatically generate your light map UVs, you'll need to find it here, make sure this matches up, but it should already be set by default by Unreal when it does that. Now, if you're creating your own light map UVs, that may be different. You may have it in another channel and this may be set to something else. So you'll want to verify that. Come in here, look at whatever channel it is that you've generated your light map UVs on in the 3D tool, and then make sure it matches up here. We can actually diagnose the texel density of our light maps to see just how good they're going to look based on our light map resolution for this object. And we can do that in the Unreal viewport. So let's check that out. So in the viewport, just click on the unlit icon there and then go down to optimization view modes and choose light map density. So this view is going to basically tell you how dense your light maps are and whether or not you need to adjust them. Basically, anything in red, that's pretty dense for the chair, so we might want to go back and reduce that down to, say, 128 by 128. Anything blue, of course, will need to be increased. So the walls and floor here, we can tell that the texel density is too low for these light maps. So we'll go into the mesh editor for these objects and increase the light map settings. There are actually a couple of ways to increase the light map size for each object. Now, you just saw how we did it for the chair using the mesh editor. When you do it in here, it does it for all the chairs. But if you have multiple objects in your scene and you want to increase the light map density just for one object and not all of those objects, you can actually just do it on a per object basis. So if you go under the details tab here, and then we can scroll down until we find the lighting settings and then override light map. And we can just change that here. So this is 64. We'll make it 128. Still too low. Let's increase it to 256. Still too low. So let's try 512. There we go. Starting to get into the green range. And then finally 1024. That's perfect for the walls here. Nice and green. You want your texel density to look or read in the viewport green here. Now, sometimes you're going to need to generate your own light maps automatically, as I said, and that's usually the case with anything organic, like folded up blankets or curtains or anything really complex. And to do that, it's really easy, and we'll just go into 3ds Max here, and we have this cushion, and I'm going to add an unwrap modifier to it, and then we're just going to edit it. Now here we have the first channel. This is our diffuse mapping, our projection mapping for the diffuse material. I'm just going to go ahead now and move to channel 2. And then on channel 2, what I want to do is we can see from the diffuse mapping here that we're overlapping the 0 to 1 space here. And you don't want to do that with a light map UV because light map UVs can't tile. So first of all, we're going to use the packing tool, so pack UVs, and we're going to set our padding to about 0.04 here. So now our UVs for our light map are nicely padded. There are no overlapping UVs, and this will generate a nice, good quality light map for this cushion. So all we need to do then is re-export this asset. Okay, so we have our pillow back inside of Unreal Studio. I'm going to turn the grid off here. We just need to use the UV dropdown again. So UV channel 0, again, that's our diffuse channel. You can see we've got overlapping, or rather UV coordinates that are outside of the 0, 1 space. And that's fine for diffuse textures, diffuse materials that use tiling and whatnot. But if we go down to UV channel 1, we're going to find that we have our UV mapping that we generated inside of 3ds Max. Now we just want to do one last step, and that's to make sure that we go over to the details panel, scroll down to general settings, and set our light map coordinate index. Right now it's set to 3, and we want to set that to 1. So the best workflow is really to go ahead and automatically let Unreal Studio generate all of your light maps on import. But once that's done, and once you've set up all your lights and done a preview bake, which we'll be doing shortly, you want to go ahead and look around in your scene for any light mapping issues. And then you need to decide if the solution to those issues is to manually create your own custom light map UVs for those objects, like we just did in 3ds Max. Sometimes increasing the light map size will solve some lighting artifacts. So remember, we can do that here under general settings. We can increase our light map size, or we can do it on a per object basis in the details settings here. However, you do want to be careful when you do this and always use your light map texel preview in the viewport, because increasing the texel density of your light maps obviously increases the amount of memory that Unreal Studio uses at runtime, and that can greatly affect performance. So now that we know how to set up all our assets to have good light mapping UVs, we can get into turning the lights on in the scene. But first, we'll look at a simple technique that can assist us in understanding the lighting in our scene in a very quick and easy read. Sometimes it can be hard to judge if the lighting in a scene is correct, and even if it is correct at one point in time, the nature of constantly altering your lighting settings as you work can easily knock the scene's lighting off kilter. A simple trick to help you read the overall scene lighting, including exposure, core shadows, reflections, and just overall lighting quality, is to create a gray ball and a chrome sphere and set them somewhere in the middle of your scene. You can group the two spheres and set them up so that they can be moved around easily as a group to view the lighting in your scene from different angles too. Anytime you want to get an idea of the overall lighting of an area of your scene, just move them into place and fire off a quick preview bake. So to get started, I'm going to go over into the modes panel, and under basic, I'm going to grab a sphere and drop it onto the table here. Now it's too large, so we'll go into our details panel and reduce the scale. We're going to bring it down to about 0.25 on all axes. And we'll name this sphere Gray Ball. Next, we'll duplicate this sphere by holding down the Alt key and dragging. And we'll name this sphere Chrome Sphere. Now, to make these two easy to move around, we're going to right-click in the World Outliner and choose Create Folder. We're going to call this folder Render Viz. And then we'll just go ahead and grab these two guys and drop them into that folder. Now, we don't want these two objects to appear when we view the walkthrough in real time, so we're going to select them both, and under the Details panel, scroll down to Rendering, and we're going to check Actor Hidden in Game. Now, if we ever want to hide these, we can just hide the folder, and then we won't see them in our level. Now, if we want to be able to move these together as a unit, we'll just go ahead and create a group out of them. So we'll select both again, right-click, and we'll choose Group. So with our group actor here selected, when we move it, we move both of them together. So the next step is to apply the materials to the two objects. So we'll start with the chrome sphere, and I'm just going to double click the material here. And right now it's using a default or a basic shape material. We'll go ahead and save that. So we'll do File, Save As, and under my Materials folder, we'll save it as M Chrome Sphere. All right, so we want to leave the color as white, and then we're going to add a metallic constant here and set that to 1. We'll show the background. Now we need to also adjust the roughness, so we'll go ahead and change that default value to 0. All right, and there we have our chrome sphere. We can go ahead and save that. For the gray ball, we're going to use the same technique. We'll load it up, and we'll save it as, and then the name of this one will be M Gray Ball. Save it in the same location here. Now for the gray ball, we're going to change the color parameter here. We're going to set the value to 0.18. Now we don't have to do anything for metallic. That should be 0 by default. We do want to make sure our roughness is set to 1. Okay, so there's our gray ball. We'll go ahead and save that. As a last step, we want to make sure that we can add our materials here to these two objects. So we'll just drag this one onto the chrome sphere, and we'll drag this one onto the gray ball. Now, obviously, in unlit mode here, they're not going to do much for us. We're not going to be able to really see their effect and be able to use them until we've actually done our light map baking. But before we can bake our light maps, there's a couple of other things we should do. First of all, we need to go ahead and disable any kind of special effects that are enabled in the level. This way we can get a better baseline for the quality of our lighting environment without any of those kind of effects getting in the way. So let's go into our project settings. And then we're going to scroll down until we find rendering. And on the right hand side here, we'll scroll down again to default settings. And we want to disable bloom, ambient occlusion, and auto exposure. And we can also turn off motion blur as well. Of course, we're still too early in the process for a good quality bake at this point, but as we go through the course, these little spheres are going to come in really handy as we continue to set things up. At this point, we're all set to begin tweaking the lighting environment to achieve a photorealistic look. So up next, we're going to look at working with the interior lights to get started. In this course, we're primarily concerned with architectural interiors. What we're really talking about when we talk about exterior lights is mimicking the sun and our sky. We can mimic the sky using the Unreal Skylight here, and our sun can be mimicked using a directional light. So just like any 3D tool, we have access to those options. The other thing we need to do is add a background to our exterior. We will show you some techniques for adding in a sky dome, essentially, that has animated clouds in it. But before we do that, let's go ahead and look at our directional or sunlight. We could just drag the directional light in here in Unreal, but we've already imported one from 3ds Max, and this is our V-Ray sun, which again is essentially a directional light. The sunlight has pretty much all of the same settings that the point and spotlights have, so we're not going to cover those again. Our sunlight is set to stationary. If we want to be able to take advantage of distance field shadows, the higher quality shadowing, we do need to be set to either stationary or movable. They will not work with static lighting. In my fully baked version of the scene, let's take a look at the light source angle. And you're going to find there are two light source angles on a directional light. The difference is the first light source angle, which you'll find under light in the details panel, this is for dynamic lights only. It only works with distance field shadows or capsule shadows, and it's for generating the softer shadow effect. So light source angle, obviously, if you increase this, it's basically increasing the size of the sun disk. And the larger the size of the sun disk, the softer the shadows you get. But remember, this is only for dynamic-based lighting. Scrolling down to our light mask settings, you'll find light source angle again. And this is for baked lighting. So if you want to increase the penumbra of your light, the shadows, this is where you'll do it for your baked lighting. So you can increase this to say 10 degrees, and this would create a much softer shadow baked into your light maps. I'm going to go ahead and set this back to the default value of 1. If we scroll down, we'll find a special effect that we can apply to a directional light, and that's light shafts. To use that, you can use two versions. You've got light shaft occlusion or light shaft bloom. I'm going to go with light shaft bloom, and we're not going to really be able to see it right now because everything's so dark, but when we come back to this, we'll just need to tweak this bloom scale and bloom threshold. And of course, under that, we have our distance field shadows. We wanted to enable those. And remember, your distance field shadows, those are going to give you a crisper shadow. Below this, on our light mask settings, we have light source angle. This is going to allow you to tweak the penumbra size. We also want to check use area shadows for stationary lights. Below this, we have cascade shadow maps. We're not going to be discussing that because these tend to apply more for larger exterior scenes than they do for interior scenes. To get some ambient lighting filtering in through our windows, aside from the direct sunlight, we have a couple of options available to us. We want to basically simulate the blue sky dome around us, and we can use either a skylight to do that, or we could use some fill lights. Of course, that's the most laborious method. But with a skylight, we can simply drop the skylight in here and just tweak some settings and get this done a lot faster. Just bear in mind, this might not be the most physically accurate result. Now, the lighting has two ways of working in the skylight. We can either capture the scene around it, or we can use a cube map, an HDR cube map of our own. By default, it's set to capture the scene. If we scroll down to Skylight, we can hit the recapture button here to go ahead and capture the scene on demand. The other option, of course, is to use our own HDR cube map. Importing an HDR image is just as easy as anything else. We'll go into our HDRI folder here, hit the import button, and grab our HDR map. I've got a 2K image here I'm going to bring in. Then I need to change the drop down so it says specified cube map, and then I can drag and drop that onto the texture swatch. Right away we can see our scene has become lit up. Our skylight is doing its job. So we can change the angle here very easily. Just use this drag and slide so we can change the direction that the cube map is facing. With intensity we can control the brightness of the skylight so we can bring it up higher or lower. Now we have distance field ambient occlusion. So distance field ambient occlusion basically uses a bent normal and it modifies the skylight's diffuse lighting. This only works on DirectX 11, any modern video card. So if you're using old hardware or maybe a mobile device, this is not going to be an option available to you. And another thing to keep in mind, to be able to use distance field ambient occlusion, you have to have shadow casting enabled for the light, which we do. Now the other thing is we need to set the light to movable instead of stationary if we want to use it. Occlusion max distance here will affect basically how far out the ambient occlusion is being rendered. We can also control the contrast of our ambient occlusion and the strength. Finally, with min occlusion, we can ensure that we don't have any areas that are fully black. So we're basically specifying the lower limit of the ambient occlusion darkness. If you find that the ambient occlusion is not very effective on a piece of geometry and you want to increase the quality settings, you can certainly do that. Just right-click on the geometry in question and choose to edit it. Then under LOD0, we want to scroll down and open Build Settings. And then under Build Settings, we see this distance field resolution here. We can increase this value. Obviously, the higher the value, the higher the quality here. But bear in mind that this will have an impact on performance. Here I have a fully baked scene using the skylight and distance field ambient occlusion. I can visualize the effect of the occlusion if I go to Show, Visualize, and then Distance Field Ambient Occlusion. Using this visualization allows us to see just the distance field ambient occlusion contribution of the skylight. Now by adjusting these parameters, we can see the effect without any of the other information such as materials or direct lighting getting in the way. The other option we have is to use fill lights on the outside of the windows. We can basically take a spotlight in Unreal like I have here. Then we're going to set a low intensity. In this case, I'll start with 50 lumens. Set the color to something kind of light blue. And then we'll simply duplicate that light. By duplicating this light across the window like this, we create the effect of an area light. In this case, we've decided to go with fill lights to our scene, but if we had used skylights in our HDR image, there is one other thing you might want to consider, and that is light mask portals. So if you go into the modes window here, the modes tab, and type light mask portal, you'll find that here, and we can drag it into the scene. So adding a light mask portal around your windows is going to basically tell the light mask baker where it should focus its efforts, and that will help to improve the quality of the lighting when using a skylight. Be careful, however, not to use them in very large levels. Stick to only interior scenes like this. Don't use them outside, otherwise that can really increase your bake times. In this case, we're not going to be needing them. Last of all, we need to add our sky dome to our exterior lighting. And we have a couple of options available to us. Obviously, we could bring a sky dome in from our 3D tool. Unreal has a few options though. First up, if we go under Visual Effects, we can use Atmospheric Fog. If we drop that into our scene, we can see it adds basically atmospheric fog outside of the scene. But it also has a sun disk, and that sun disk can be tied to the actual directional light in the scene. But rather than use that, I'm going to use something called a BP Sky Sphere. So if you do a search for BP Sky, there we go. Inside of your modes tab here, we'll just drop that into the scene. We get the same basic effect as the atmospheric fog. The BP Sky Sphere, or let's just call it Sky Sphere for now because it's a bit of a mouthful, it allows you to have animated clouds as well as the sun disk. So what we're going to do first of all to get it set up is under the Details panel, under Default, we want to set the Directional Light Actor. So just click on the drop down and we'll pick our V-Ray Sunlight here. And obviously that changes the color of the sky right off the bat to match where the sun is in the sky. Now, one great benefit of adding our sky dome is now we have some color in the background, and this means that our sun's light rays can get some color to generate themselves. So if we pan the camera around here, we can see the effect, and they're obviously way too pronounced. So at this point, we'd want to go into our sunlight, scroll down to our light shafts, and just adjust the scale here, bring it down to something a little more reasonable. Now, after we've got our sunlight attached to the sky sphere, we can start to play with the cloud settings. So for cloud opacity, that's going to tell you how many clouds you want visible in your scene. So let's go ahead and increase that value, and you'll start to see the clouds appear. We can go really, really dense. At the default settings, the cloud speed of 1.0 is a nice subtle effect, but if you want to get an idea of them actually moving, we can pump it way up to 5, kind of exaggerated, but now we can see them moving across really nicely there. Okay, so we still have some things we want to set up, such as reflection and volumetric lighting, but we'll go ahead and fire off a test light map bake to see where we stand. My test bake is completed. I wanted to mention on the build settings for the solver, I used lighting quality medium. You want to avoid using anything higher than that when you're doing test bakes. Normally you would use preview, but I decided to go for a slightly higher resolution version here. We'll talk more about that when we discuss light mask settings. There are some issues, even though this came out pretty good for a test bake. You'll notice on the rug here, we've got some resolution issues. We could probably solve that by increasing the light map resolution on the rug, as well as increasing the solver settings and tweaking the light mask settings themselves. There's also some light leaking. So if we look at the floor here, we've got some obvious light leaking. This could be bleed because actually this floor is not a flat plane. This floor is actually made up of all of the individual planks of the hardwood floor. And as a result, when the light map was generated, it's got a lot of planks on there that are pretty close to each other. And so we're getting some bleed over there that we're going to have to fix. We can see our gray ball and chrome sphere here are doing a great job of telling us very quickly what our scene lighting is like. We obviously have our core shadows, and you can see some resolution issues here. That's probably because of the solver's settings and some other light map settings we'll need to adjust. We can also see the reflection environment. I've gone ahead and added in the ability to get reflections on our materials. Now, if you notice, this reflection is not 100% accurate. We can see the tops of the lamps above here reflected in the environment, and obviously this should not be reflecting at this point. If we look over on this wall here, we can see some obvious light map UV issues here, as well as some darkness at the bottom of this object that shouldn't be there. So I'm guessing in this case, we probably have some bad light map UVs. We're going to have to manually generate them for this object. Another thing is the walls. These walls are basically a solid piece all the way around the scene. We might want to break that up into individual walls. In the viewport, there are a couple of diagnostic modes we can use to look at our lighting without extra information. So for instance, if we go to lit and then change this to detail lighting, we're getting the lighting information without materials, but we're still getting reflections. We can also go into lighting only mode, and this is purely the lighting information. There are no reflections in this mode. Next, we'll take a look at the systems available to us in Unreal Studio for adding high-quality reflections to objects like glasses and mirrors, as well as also impacting the lighting environment. We'll see you there. Adding reflections to your real-time scene is another integral piece of the photorealistic puzzle, and there are two ways to do reflections. The first way is to use baked reflections, which are generated using reflection probes that we can manually add to the level. The core benefit to reflection probes is that they have very little performance impact, but they do take up space and memory. So if you're working with limited memory, you'll need to be careful with how detailed or how large the textures generated by reflection probes are, as well as how many of them you put into your scene. The other drawback is that these reflections aren't 100% accurate, as they use cube or spherical mapping to generate the reflections. So for instance, if I go over here and look inside of this mirror, we can see that we're seeing the table here as if we were above it, and we're also seeing the top of the lamp here. So this is obviously very inaccurate. The solution to this would be to add more reflection probes throughout the scene in order to capture the environment as accurately as possible. There are two types of reflection probes that you can use. The first is the box reflection capture. This is generally used for rectangular or square rooms, but it's considered the most inaccurate version of the reflection capture. You'll find it under Visual Effects, Box Reflection Capture. The sphere reflection capture actor is just as inaccurate, but because it's a sphere, you see the inaccuracies all from the same point in a diameter around the capture actor, so they all have the same distortion applied to them. This is the preferred capture actor to use. The trick to using a capture actor is to place them strategically around the scene, then increase the size. In order for reflections to work at all, any material that is supposed to be reflective needs to have its roughness and specular parameters adjusted. So we can see here we have a metallic value of 1 and a very low roughness of 0.02. We'll show the background, and that makes this a very reflective, polished material. Using the Reflection Override view mode, you can visualize the reflections in your scene. Click on Lit and then click on Reflections. This shows us what our cube map looks like applied to all of the objects in the scene. This will allow you to find distortions and other areas where you'll probably need to add more reflection capture actors. When you build your scene, it will automatically generate reflections. But if you want to do it manually, click the down arrow next to Build and choose Build Reflection Captures. We decided to go with a skylight for the scene, but if you do use fill lights, you will notice the lights in any reflections. Here you can see the 6 fill lights in this window. In order to get rid of that, we can go to those lights, scroll down to the light settings, and then open the advanced settings. Look for the min roughness value, which is defaulted at 0.08, and set this to 1. This removes the lights essentially because you've softened their specular highlights so much that you can't see them in the reflection. We can also take advantage of screen space reflections. Screen space reflections are very accurate reflections that are generated by the video card during runtime. Since they aren't baked, they don't take up any texture memory, but they can have a big impact on frame rate. So using them is up to you, and it also depends upon the platform you'll be using. For VR, generally, screen space reflections are too expensive. Translucent materials on objects such as this glass pitcher can make use of screen space reflections. Open the material, then on the Details panel, we'll scroll down to Translucency and just make sure Screen Space Reflections is checked. After the material has compiled, you'll be able to see the reflections on the translucent material. For high density meshes, you can go into the mesh settings and find under the build settings for LOD0, use high precision tangent basis. Now, if you enable this, this is going to give you a higher quality screen space reflection for this mesh. Another option for increasing the quality of your screen space reflections is to go into your project settings. From here, do a search for gbuffer. gbuffer will be found under Engine Rendering. Set the format from default to high precision. This will give you higher quality screen space reflections for the entire scene. Also, we can do a search for Reflection Capture Resolution, also found under Engine Rendering. This is set to 128 by default, but we can increase this up to 1024 to get higher quality, more detailed screen space reflections. Reflections can add a great deal of realism to your scene, and they also impact the lighting environment. Spending time making sure they look as accurate as possible will pay off. While most architectural scenes are static, there may be times when you want to have moving actors, such as movable furniture, or even vehicles or characters that move around in the scene. With that in mind, up next, we'll take a look at using volumetric light maps and some other techniques to achieve the best quality lighting for those moving actors. Anytime you have a dynamic, moving actor in your scene, it won't be properly lit using standard surface light maps. Moving an object in the editor will invalidate the light baking. Most of the objects in your scene are going to be static. That means they're not allowed to move. If you want to have a moving object, you need to set it to movable. One option for lighting this movable object would be, of course, to use dynamic lights. We can even get soft shadowing using ray-traced distance field shadows. However, Unreal has a volumetric lighting system that can be used to generate voxels around the level. Each of these spherical voxels can store lighting information from all directions. As a moving actor moves through the scene, it will get the lighting information from these voxels on a per pixel basis, creating much better lighting that respects shadows and color information. Volumetric light maps can even be used to add high-quality, diffused lighting effects to fog. We're not going to be getting into that aspect of it in this course, as generally you're not going to find fog effects in architectural interiors. But let's look at how to generate volumetric light maps and see the effects on moving objects. When you bake your light maps, your volumetric light maps will also be generated. Click on the World settings. Under Light Mass, you'll find the options for your volumetric light maps. There are 3 options here, but I generally like to only change one: Volumetric Light Map Detail Size. It's currently set to 200. In order to know what we need to change it to, let's go ahead and visualize our volumetric light map. Click on the Show button and then scroll down to Visualize, and we'll find at the very bottom Volumetric Light Map. Here we can see the voxels in our scene. If we go outside, we're going to see a lot more of them. And each of these voxels is storing light map information. I can tell just by looking at the scene that we don't have enough voxels. We need these to be more dense. I'm going to reduce this value down to 50. The smaller this value is, the closer together they'll be. In order for the change to be applied, we'll have to do a light map bake. But before we do that, let's add a light mass importance volume to limit the location of our volumetric light voxels. Do a search for light mass, and you'll find the importance volume. I'm going to drag it into the scene here, and my objective is to basically surround just this interior with the importance volume. This will tell light mass that this is the only area that we want baked. By doing this, we'll also get the added benefit of light mass only building the volumetric light map voxels within the same space. You can see the result of my light map bake here. The density of the volumetric light map voxels is much greater. Let's go ahead and turn off the visualization now. Grabbing this actor, I'll go ahead and move it around. Bear in mind that the item is being affected by the stationary directional light, and it's generating dynamic shadows on the object. However, it's also being affected by the volumetric lighting, allowing it to mix in better with the baked lighting. As there's no baked lighting on this object, this side of the object is completely in shadow and would be black normally. But because of the volumetric lighting, we get the effect of some GI light bounce happening. You could continue to decrease the cell size or the distance between the cells to get a more accurate result. Just bear in mind that as you bring them closer together and thus increase the number of bricks, you're going to begin to affect performance. Now that we've got all our lights set up in the scene and we've created reflection probes and volumetric lighting for movable objects, we're ready to look at the bake settings to get the best quality. Up next, we'll cover the best settings to get photorealistic light bakes. The final step in generating our lighting is to tweak the light map settings to get the highest quality with the least amount of time to bake. The good news is, Unreal's light mass doesn't really require a lot of tweaks to get good quality. You can pretty much just hit build lighting and it does a great job already. Looking under the world settings and light mass may seem daunting at first, but let's take some time to demystify the most important settings to get the best results. And those settings are right at the top. Under Light Mass Settings, you'll find Static Lighting Level Scale. This is defaulted to 1, and this basically is saying that the scale of your scene is in the Unreal unit scale of 1 centimeter. If you were doing exteriors, which we aren't doing in this course, you could increase this value to 2 or 4 as it says in the help, and this will help to reduce the build time. One technique would be to reduce this down to, say, 0.1, and then increase the indirect lighting quality up to 10. The idea here would be that static lighting level scale times indirect lighting quality should never be more than 1.0. So for instance, if we brought static lighting level scale down to 0.5, we'd set indirect lighting scale to 2 and get 1.0. Generally, however, you should leave this at a value of 1.0 for your interior scenes. For a number of indirect lighting bounces, you should keep this between 3 and 5. You can increase this drastically, but honestly, past about 5 bounces, you're not going to see any significant improvement to the scene's quality. If you're using a skylight, such as we are in this scene, you can increase the number of skylighting bounces as well. We'll go ahead and leave it at the default setting of 1 for now, but we might increase it up to 2 or 3 bounces, depending on how bright we want our scene to look. As for indirect lighting quality, this is defaulted to 1. Of course, increasing this value will increase the build time, but also the quality of your light maps. Below this, we have indirect lighting smoothness. For high quality, you can set this value to 1.1 or 1.2. However, if you're increasing the indirect lighting quality above 1, it's generally a good idea to set this to something like 0.75. By doing so, you can increase the shadow quality while keeping your build times lower. Many of the next options are self-explanatory, and we've already covered volumetric light maps. The next thing up would be use ambient occlusion. This will give you more detailed ambient occlusion, and it will work in conjunction with the distance field ambient occlusion of our skylight. Each mesh also has its own light mask settings. For instance, on this chair, if we go to the details panel, we can scroll down to the light mask settings for the chair. We've already talked about using two-sided lighting. For any objects that have one-sided faces that need to have two sides, this is how you'll get the lighting to affect both sides of the face. After this, we have use emissive for static lighting. For instance, the light bulbs in these lamps has use emissive for static lighting checked. These light bulbs have an emissive property in their material, and so this can actually affect the geometry around it. To improve your baking speed, there are a couple of things you can do. First of all, you have your light mask importance volume, which we talked about in the volumetric lighting chapter. This will tell light mask to only bake in that area. Another option, of course, that we looked at earlier was to reduce the light map texel density. So if we go to Lit, Optimization View Modes, Light Map Density, remember, you want these all to be as close to green as possible. I have a few items in here that are red because I wanted to have a higher resolution shadow on these objects. So it's okay to break that rule sometimes. Just remember though, the more you break those rules, the more of a chance that you're going to have performance problems. If we jump back over to our light mask settings, setting these values to lower values, of course, or just setting them to the default values will obviously improve your bake times. And finally, under Build, if we click the drop-down arrow, we can choose the lighting quality from production down to preview. The higher the solver is set to, the longer it's going to take, but the better the quality will be. Preview is great for quick, low-res bakes to get an overall idea of your lighting environment results. You can easily jump up to medium without sacrificing too much build time. Even building with high will go pretty fast. It's not until you get to production level that you really start to see a slowdown, but the end result is well worth it. Now that we know the settings we need to get high-quality light map bakes, let's discuss how we can speed up that light map baking by using Unreal Studio's distributed rendering tool, the Swarm. Baking light maps can take a great deal of time. Obviously, the larger the scene, the higher the quality settings, and depending upon your light mask settings, the more this time grows. Light map bakes can often take entire days. This is where having a render farm at your disposal helps. It could be as simple as having a few more PCs on your home or work network that you can use. It goes without saying that each PC should be of fairly moderate to high-end capability, because any PCs that are lower quality are going to obviously drag down the render time and can actually make things worse. To bake light maps in a distributed network like this, you'll need to set up and use the Swarm, which comes with Unreal Studio. We have two applications that we can use, the Swarm Agent and the Swarm Coordinator. Now the agent, it needs to be on every rendering node. The agent will basically communicate back to the Swarm Coordinator. The coordinator will handle sending out the render jobs. So let's take a quick look at where you can find both. Typically your Epic Games Editor installation is going to be found under the C drive on Windows, then under Program Files, Epic Games, UE, in this case 4.19, then go into your Engine folder, Binaries, .NET. Here you'll find the two applications we'll be using. Swarm Agent. This goes on each render node, including the node that has the coordinator. Then we have the Swarm Coordinator. Again, this will be controlling the render job. The Swarm Agent needs to be launched on all of the computers in your network. In the Swarm Agent, before we can use it, we do need to set it up so that all of the computers are communicating together. Locate Distribution Settings, and then directly under that, you'll find Agent Group Name. This is whatever name you want it to be for your network. Mine's called Pluto Swarm. Below this, we have Allowed Remote Agent Group. This should match your agent group name. Below this, we have Allowed Remote Agent Names, and these are the names of the other computers on the network that you'll be using as render nodes. My computers are named Delta and Omega. If you skip a line down, you'll find Coordinator Remoting Host. This is where you'll put the name of the computer that the Swarm Coordinator is running on. In this case, my computer's name is Office. Of course, you'll need to set this up on all of the computers that are being used as render nodes as well. So launch the Swarm Agent on those computers and put in all of the same information. So if I were to go to the Delta computer, here I would put Omega and Office. And likewise, if I go onto the Omega computer, I would put Delta and Office here, where the coordinator would always be Office. Here I've launched the Swarm coordinator on my Office computer, and we can see that it has automatically detected the other computers on the rendering farm. So we have Delta, then we have Office, which is this one, and then Omega. To the far right, we have a couple of columns here that tell us how many of the CPU cores are going to be used for rendering. Now, Delta is less powerful, obviously, than the other two computers, so it might not be such a good choice to use it because it can possibly slow down the render time. Looks like I need to upgrade. Omega is slower than Office, but not by enough for me to be worried. At this point, all we need to do is fire off a lightmap bake. Launching the Swarm agent again, I can now see all three computers in the agent, Office, Omega, and Delta, and they are actually beginning to work on the render. All of these bars represent the different cores on each computer and what they're doing. Down below, you'll find color coding to let you know exactly what each of these is. Using the Swarm is going to significantly cut your lightmap baking times. With our lightmaps fully baked, we'll now take a look at additional ways to add to the photorealism of the scene using what are known as post-processing effects. Continuing our discussion of post-processing effects, let's jump down to the lens effects, where you'll find the real fun stuff. Lens effects simulate real camera lens effects at runtime. So if you're a photographer, if you've ever worked with a digital or even an analog camera, you'll know some of the basic options such as ISO and f-stops and all of that. And you may also be familiar with things like depth of field and lens dirt and exposure settings. So you're going to have all of those options here under lens effects that you can use. Of course, a lot of these settings are not settings that the human eye is going to experience. Some of them are, but generally a lot of these, such as chromatic aberration and lens dirt, you're not going to see this on the human eye. So using these really depends upon where you want to go with the scene. If you want it to feel like you're physically there as a person and you're walking through, or if you want it to be more like it's a camera, then that's going to affect how many of these effects that you choose to use. Now, before we dive into these, let's go into our project settings and have a quick look at some of the options we have there. If we go down to engine rendering and then scroll down to the bottom here to default settings, you'll find bloom, ambient occlusion, and auto exposure, as well as some other things, motion blur. You can enable these here, and these are scene-wide effects. Even without a post-processing volume, these will work. But you can also enable these separately within the post-processing volume, so we don't have to really enable any of these here. And of course, using the post-process volume, when we enable those in the project settings, these settings here will allow us to control the intensity of those settings and other parts of those effects. Now, I will say that exposure should be added to your scene very last. You want to add everything else before you begin to play with the exposure settings. You also do not want to use all of these effects because they will stack up and become sometimes a little overbearing, but also will affect performance. A little goes a long way, so try not to use these too much. Just use them to kind of kiss in some effects to get that nice little extra bit of realism. Find the ones that you really like and that give you the most bang for your buck. We'll start out by looking at chromatic aberration. Now this has only two settings, intensity and the offset. So I'll bring intensity up really high, kind of exaggerated so you can see the effect, and I'll do the same thing with the start offset here a little bit. So you can see what's happening here is that there's a little bit of a distortion, a barreling effect to the lens. As well, there's some separation of the colors, simulating a lens that's kind of old, creating the chromatic aberration effect. This can be kind of distracting though, and if you only use it very subtly, it can soften the image a little bit. So if you're going for a softer look, this might be the option for you. Next up, we have bloom, which is a very popular effect to use. Now, you have a lot of options under bloom here, and you open up the advanced options here too to get even more, but we're just going to use it very simply in this situation. Bloom is a simulation of HDR effects, and it's not really physically accurate, but it works in most situations. If you've done a lot of 3D rendering, you're probably already very familiar with bloom. I'm going to adjust the intensity and the threshold. We'll set my intensity to 1, and then my threshold to 8. Let's look up here at some lights. We can really see that bloom kicking in the mirror over there. So intensity, obviously, that's going to scale the bloom color linearly. And then threshold, what that does is the lower this value, the greater amount of colors in your scene will affect the bloom. So if we brought this all the way down to -1, you can see the bloom is much softer. It's being affected by almost the entire scene. As we bring it up, it starts to tighten in on just a certain range of colors. And I'm going to bring mine up all the way to the top so that only the brightest whites will affect it. All right, moving on, we'll look at the dirt mask now. This allows you to add lens dirt, scratches, and dust speckles and whatnot. What this requires is a dirt mask texture, so we'll enable that, and I'll go into my textures folder here. I have a dirt mask. Go ahead and drop it in there. So the dirt mask needs to have some special settings applied to it. So we'll open it up in the texture editor. And really all we want to make sure of is that it's not using any MIP maps. So no MIP maps. And then we don't want to stream this texture. So if you look under texture and then open the advanced settings, you'll find never stream. Just make sure that that is checked. Now, I'm not going to be using a dirt mask in my scene because it can be kind of distracting, but it's a really pretty effect actually. I'm going to go ahead and enable the intensity and pump it up really high, and then we'll look towards something really bright, something with a lot of bloom, and you can just make out the speckles appearing. There we go, on the side, kind of at the corner there, you can see some really nice speckling going on. Again, this one can be kind of distracting. It just depends on the look you're going for. After Dirt Mask, you have your camera settings for ISO and f-stop and all of that. However, these do not work in a post-process volume. These are only usable if you're doing post-process effects using a physical camera inside of Unreal. Next up, we have exposure. We're going to skip over that for now because, as I said, you want to do your exposure settings last. Below this, we have lens flares. Again, probably something you're very familiar with if you're doing any 3D rendering. I'm just going to turn on intensity so we get our lens flare there. Below this, we have the ability to tint the color of the lens flare. We can control the bokeh size, so I'll bring this up a little bigger. Okay, next up we have image effects, and with image effects you can add things like vignetting and camera grain. So if you're going for an older kind of look, an old film look, you can get that here using vignetting and then, of course, camera grain. All right, so now we have more of an old film kind of look, and we could even use color grading here to add a sepia tone to this if we wanted to do something like that. We're going for a more realistic look here, so we're not going to use any of these image effects. Finally, we have depth of field. I'm going to use bokeh depth of field because I find it's the best looking depth of field, but you do have several other options. You can use Gaussian or circle depth of field. For this, I'm going to set a focal distance of about 150. I'm going to bump the scale up, but just a little bit, just kiss it into a value of about 0.1. Obviously, I could go much higher, and we can see it just blurs out the entire scene. But I'm going to bring it way down. Could probably go down even a little bit lower. I'm going to set my max bokeh size, though, to 5 instead of 15, and that subdues the effect quite a bit. You can control the focal region, the near transition and far transition, and a lot of other stuff. And there are, of course, a lot of advanced settings underneath it as well. But this is really all I need for the effect I'm going for. So the cool thing here is that we have a nice soft blurring or depth of field very close, and then everything else is pretty much in focus. Now with depth of field, you may have issues where your transparent objects do not blur out. That's easily solved if you just go ahead and select your transparent object and then open the translucent material for that. When you select the material node, scroll down under translucency and make sure that you have render after depth of field unchecked. Under rendering features, you'll find some more post-process effects. We're going to talk about ambient occlusion in the next segment, but let's look at screen space reflections first. So the scene in Unreal by default has screen space reflections working, and generally you're going to see those screen space reflections on the edges of smooth mirrored objects, and the rest of this is being done using a reflection capture actor. But if we go ahead and just look at the edge here, this is where the transition between reflection capture and screen space reflections usually happens. You can just kind of make out the transition occurring there as I move around a little bit. It's kind of rough, but it's not too bad. However, we can improve this a little bit if we go under screen space reflections, click intensity, click quality, and click max roughness. You have 3 options here for controlling these settings. Now, I'm going to leave my intensity at a value of 100, but I'm going to boost up my quality to a value of 100 as well. Now, it may not be very noticeable, but the idea is that boosting up your quality will give you a much better reflection. Another way to improve the quality of screen space reflections is in your project settings. So we'll go there and do a quick search for reflection. Now, the reflection capture resolution by default is at 128. I've set mine to 512. You can go as high as 1024 here. When you do that, of course, it's going to rebake the reflection captures. Just bear in mind, as you're raising those quality settings, it's going to affect the performance of the environment because you're increasing the overall size of the texture that's generated by a factor of 4 when you go from 512 to 1024. So if we look around our scene with auto exposure settings enabled, we'll see the changes as we go from dark to light. So you can see here as I went into this darker hallway, it's really brightening up. If I turn around, it instantly goes back down, or not instantly, but much quicker. I'm going to pretty much leave these settings at default because I like the way they look. But we can actually visualize the exposure, the auto exposure, using a histogram. You'll find the visualization under Show, Visualize, HDR Eye Adaptation. This is a histogram showing you the settings that you have here for the maximum brightness, min brightness, and so forth. And as I turn around, there's my maximum brightness before it comes down. And so you can see the histogram is reacting, the auto exposure is reacting, so that white line represents the adaptation that's occurring. So if I turn around, you can see it goes down much slower to get to the lower level there. So I'm going to set my speed down to a much lower value here and then turn around, and we can see by lowering it, the speed of the histogram to adapt is going much, much slower. Let's go ahead and set that back to 1. Same thing works with speed up. We'll bring this way down to 0.1, turn around, and we can see it's affecting the speed as my eyes adapt to the brighter environment. Let's go ahead and set this back to 3. Using these effects are really easy, but using them comes at great cost to the performance of your real-time walkthrough. Remember, in the case of these effects, a little goes a long way, so we don't want to overuse them. Adjust the settings by tiny increments until you get the look you want. And pick a few you think add the most bang for your buck. Don't try to use them all because they can overwhelm each other, and remember again, the performance will be impacted. Next up, we'll look at one more effect, and that's screen space ambient occlusion, with a little discussion on some of your other AO options. Ambient occlusion improves the lighting environment by darkening corners and cracks, simulating how light has a hard time bouncing around into those tiny little cracks and stuff. In Unreal Studio, there are several options for adding it into your scene. Let's take a quick look at them and discuss their uses. In all Unreal materials, you can apply ambient occlusion to your material node, and this works great for things like cavity maps on a per-object basis. Of course, you'll need to bake an ambient occlusion map from your 3D tool to be able to use this. Also, as we've seen earlier in the course, under your light baking settings for light mask, you can enable ambient occlusion. You can also generate your ambient occlusion as a mask that gets multiplied onto your light maps. With these two options, with light mask and your material settings, these are baked options for ambient occlusion. We also saw with skylights that are set to movable or fully dynamic, you can use distance field ambient occlusion. And this creates a real-time, dynamic, soft effect of ambient occlusion in the entire scene. Under rendering features in our post-process volume, we have another dynamic, real-time ambient occlusion. And this is the effect that we'll be using in our scene here. But you can certainly layer the different ambient occlusion options. You can bake ambient occlusion into the scene using light mask, and then you can layer on top of that the screen space ambient occlusion to get a more layered effect. For my ambient occlusion, I'm going to enable intensity and radius. Intensity, obviously, that controls the strength. Now, in order to see the effect clearly, we're going to visualize the ambient occlusion. So we'll go under Lit, then Buffer Visualizations, and down towards the bottom, you'll find ambient occlusion. So here, if I drop this all the way to 0, we see no effect, but I'm going to bring this up to a value of 1 to make it pretty strong. I'm going to change the radius down to 10, and this will affect the tightness of the ambient occlusion effect. With this lower setting, the ambient occlusion will not be as affected by objects that are further away. We can see by increasing the radius, it increases the softness of the ambient occlusion effect. So I'm going to drop this back down to about a value of 10. Next, we'll look at radius in world units. So normally the radius is in screen space units, but we're going to use world space units. You can see the difference of the effect here. Then we have power setting, and I'm going to bring this all the way up to a value of 8 to make it much stronger. And then we have quality. I'm going to bring this up to a value of 100. Now let's look around the scene here. Obviously this is exaggerated a little bit more than I would like. Take note that because it's a depth-based effect, it's creating halos around objects that would not normally be there. We can work with this by changing the fade out distance. So I'm going to enable that and bring it down to a value of 1000. So now we can see that it's having a great effect on the scene, not as pronounced as it was, and we're also getting rid of most of the halos. So the further away an object is, the less of the ambient occlusion that we see on it, but as we get in closer, it starts to get more pronounced, and the halo effect of it is a lot less pronounced. Okay, so I kind of like the look that I'm getting here. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it at these settings. Now, this is a very subtle effect, so when we go back to lit mode, it's going to be hard to tell if it's there, but it's definitely there, having an impact on the scene. So at this stage of your project, you should be pretty much wrapping up the visual fidelity, the visual look of your scene. Of course, continue to tweak your post-processing effects until you get the desired look. And of course, you'll want to also continue to improve your light maps, improve your light bakings. Maybe now's a good time to go ahead and jump up in your build settings to production quality. It's going to take a while, but using Swarm, of course, you'll be able to bring that time down if you have several other computers that you can use. We'll spend the next part of the course going over how to set up various interactions in your walkthrough, starting with first adding collision to the scene. See you there. In the real world, everything is solid or corporeal. You can't simply walk through a wall, but in the digital world, you can walk right through a wall or a couch or anything. But in order for us to have a scene where the viewer can walk around without fear of falling through the floor or going through the walls and seeing the man behind the curtain, we need to add collision. Now, there's several ways to do that using Unreal Studio, each of them offering different levels of control as well as different eases of use. First of all, we could create our own collision using our 3D tool and import that into Unreal. This option is the least efficient way to do it, but it does provide the most control over the shape of your collision object. I'm not going to go into that because we're going to be using the methods inside of Unreal Studio, but if you'd like to see how to do that in my data preparation course, I have a more complete chapter on using collision and creating custom collision detection inside of 3ds Max. Another option is when you import your assets, you can have Unreal automatically generate collision on a mesh when it's imported. Let's look at those options really quick. If we click on Import and then find an FBX file here, right at the top, you'll find under Mesh, Auto Generate Collision. You want to have that enabled in order for Unreal to create collision for you. Now, the option we'll be using here in Unreal Studio is using the Mesh Editor to create the collision. Let's select one of these chairs, and we'll right-click and edit it. Inside the Mesh Editor, we'll click on Collision, and we can use Simple or Complex. If we turn on Complex, you can see it's using the actual chair mesh as collision. This is not something you want to do. This is going to be very expensive. Instead, we're going to use Simple Collision. You'll see when I have Simple Collision checked, there's no collision box because I didn't import any collision, and I didn't have Unreal create it for me. To do that, we'll go to the Collision menu option up here. And here we have several ways to create collision. We can use a sphere, a capsule, a box, and these options here, these 10 DOP options and 18 DOP and 26 DOP, these are different levels of complexity for your collision box. So if I use a 26 DOP simplified collision, we can see that it does its best to match the shape of the chair. Going back to collision, I can remove that collision very simply using delete selected collision. For this chair, we're just going to use a simple box collision. And most of your assets in your architectural interior don't need to be anything more than a box collision. Just remember, the more detailed your collision boxes are, the greater the effect on the performance. And that's really all there is to adding collision to your scene. You want to go through and add it to all of the objects that make sense. You don't want to add it to everything. So you don't want to add it to the bowls and plates and wine glasses and lamps. You generally want to add it only to the things that the viewer has a chance of bumping into. That would be the walls, of course the floor. You probably don't even need it on the ceiling. You'll need it on large chairs and tables and poles and anything that you're going to bump into. This whole island here could have one collision box around it and be just fine. Of course, little things on the floor like this, you'll want to add some collision around them as well. So with all of our furniture and walls set up for collision, we'll be able to keep the viewer in the space we want them to experience. Now it's time to set up the input controls that allow the viewer to move around. We'll look at that up next. Adding interactivity to your real-time walkthroughs may seem daunting, but Unreal Studio makes it super easy. When we first created our project, we chose to use the first-person template, giving us a leg up on adding interaction. We could have built a project's interactions from scratch, but why reinvent the wheel when Epic has done such a good job for us already with the template? The only real issue to solve here is that architectural interiors don't usually have the ability for the viewer to jump around or shoot at things, but we can fix that pretty easily. Let's do a quick play test so you can see what I'm talking about. So in our play test, we can shoot, and we can jump, and we have a crosshair on the screen, and then finally we have a gun and arms, and all this we need to get rid of. To do this, we'll go to the Blueprints option in the menu here. Go down to Game Mode, Edit First Person Game Mode, and we're going to go down to HUD, Edit First Person HUD, and then choose Edit First Person HUD. And in here, we can delete this entire thing, or we can simply break this connection right here. It really depends on what you want to do. If you're going to ever want to have a crosshair in your HUD, you'll want to leave this. So I'm just going to go ahead and right-click here and choose Break Link, and then Compile. Okay, so that should get rid of our HUD, and thus our crosshair. Now we also want to make sure that we can't jump. Let's open our project settings. Then under Engine, we'll go to Input. In Input is where you're going to find all of the keyboard and gamepad and motion control mappings for moving around the scene or doing any other kind of interaction such as firing the gun or jumping. Right at the top here we have Jump and Fire. So I'm just going to delete each of these entries, but you can see that under Jump we have 3 options for being able to jump. We can hit the space bar, we can use a gamepad fire button, or we can use a motion controller trigger. And of course using the drop down here allows you to choose all of these different options. So we'll go ahead and delete Jump and delete Fire. We'll also delete Reset VR, but bear in mind if you're building for a VR project, you'll want to keep this in. So that leaves us with Move Forward, Move Right, Turn Rate, Turn, Look Up, and Look Up Rate. Now we'll go back to Blueprints under Game Mode and choose Edit Pawn or First Person Character here. Here we have 3 tabs that we want to work with. We have Viewport, and Viewport contains our first person camera, as well as our collision capsule and our arms and gun. Under Construction, we have a script that attaches all of these objects, the gun and the arms, to the character when the character is first created. And then under Event Graph, we have everything tied to all of the input that we just looked at in the project settings. Starting from the top, we have some blueprint nodes here that if you read the comments, it basically hides certain parts of the character. So specifically, it hides the arms and just leaves the gun. We don't need this since we're not working in VR, so I'm just going to select it all and delete it. We can also delete this Reset VR. Below this, we have stick input. This is if you want to use a gamepad. We'll leave that in. Next over to this, we have the movement input. Now take note just briefly that all of these red nodes, these are events that fire. And if you look at the names of the red nodes, we have move forward, move right, and so forth. These are the names from the input settings that we just looked at. When move forward occurs, it's going to send the axis information over to this add movement input, as well as letting it know that move forward has occurred. And then this node will take all the information it needs to know from the first person camera as far as what direction the player is facing or the viewer is facing, and then it will be used to move the character or the viewer himself in that direction. Using blueprints and learning how to work with them effectively is a course unto itself. We're just summarizing how you can quickly get up and running using the first person template here. Moving down to the next part, we have mouse input, and this is for looking around the scene using the mouse. Then we have jump. We can go ahead and delete that because we won't be jumping. Finally, we have spawn projectile. This is for firing the gun, and we also don't need that, so we'll just select it and delete it. We also want to go under our construction script here, and we're going to delete this entire thing. We're going to leave the construction script, but we want to delete attach to component, and we want to delete these 2 components. Now over into the viewport, we're ready to delete the actual mesh objects. Keep the camera and the capsule object for our collision, so we'll just delete the gun, the arms, and this would be the VR gun. We can delete that too, and we should be fine with what we have here. Now pressing the compile button, we should be able to compile. There we go, compile results, no errors. We can save all of this and do another playtest. All right, so we have no crosshair, we have no armor gun, we still have our collision, and we can walk around the level. At this point, this may be all you need. You now have a working walkthrough, fully lit, everything that you need to deliver it to someone and allow them to walk around the scene and appreciate all the hard work you've put into it. But what's a real-time walkthrough without the ability to change the environment? We'll look at 2 ways to do that. First up, let's look at how to use blueprints to be able to pick up and move a piece of furniture from place to place. Specifically, I've added a movable piece of furniture here. This little wooden table here, this chunk of wood, we've set it in the detail panels to movable, and this will allow us to pick it up and move it around using the blueprint controls. And we'll talk about that up next. Being able to move furniture and other items in the scene can really differentiate your walkthroughs from videos and still images, as well as real-time walkthroughs that don't have any of these options, providing easy to do and virtually unlimited customization for your intended viewers. For this part of the course, we're going to build a blueprint that allows us to pick up furniture with the press of a keyboard button or a gamepad controller. If you haven't learned the basics of Blueprint yet, it's definitely a good idea to do that before proceeding. It may seem a daunting task if you've never worked with Blueprint or used programming languages before, but don't worry, you can simply set this up once following along and then use it again and again throughout your walkthroughs. First, we need to make sure that our piece of movable furniture here is ready to go. So under the Details panel, we're going to scroll down to our Physics and Collision options. Under Physics, we want to simulate physics, so we'll enable that, and this allows it to begin to take advantage of the built-in physics system in Unreal. Under Collision, we want to set the collision preset to Physics Actor. Under this, we want to use CCD, or Continuous Collision Detection. Now we'll open our first-person character blueprint, so we'll go to Blueprints, Game Mode, Edit First-Person Game Mode, go down to our pawn, and edit that. We'll jump over to the viewport. And first we need to add a position for us to be able to grab the object. And this is where the object will be held. To do this, we need to add a couple of components. So we'll click the Add Component button. First of all, we need a physics handle. So we'll grab that. And we also need a scene component. So we can see our scene component is attached to the first person camera, and we'll just drag it to where we want the object that we pick up to be positioned when we pick it up. Now we need to create a ray tracing system that will look for objects in the world as we're moving around. We'll basically be firing a ray or drawing a line between our player and the objects in the world, and we'll use this to detect if we have a movable piece of furniture that we can pick up. So for this, we'll jump over to our event graph, and in Unreal it's called a line trace. So I'm going to right click and choose Line Trace by Channel. So again, we're going to be drawing our line from the camera. So we need to bring the camera into our blueprint here. So we'll just grab the camera and drag it in. From here, we need to get the location of the camera, and we need to find out what direction we're facing. So I'm going to pull off of the camera here, and then we're going to do a search for Get World Location. I'm going to pull off of the camera again and do a search for Get Forward Vector. Now the world location, we'll just go ahead and pull that into the input on start for our line trace. And this is where the line trace will start, at the first person camera. So we have the forward vector of our camera. What we're going to do is multiply this by, say, 200 centimeters. So we'll pull off of the return value here, do a search for float vector, and we'll put in our value here of 200. Just going to move this over a little bit so we can see more of the blueprint space. So now we want to add this value of 200 to the world location of the camera. So we'll use a vector addition node for that. So we'll pull off of the camera here and do a search for vector plus vector. There we go. And then we'll pipe this into the second input. And now we can apply this to the end of our line trace. We accidentally used subtract, but what we really wanted to do here was multiply. So let's go ahead and delete this node. We'll right click and choose float times vector. There we go. Vector times float it is. Now we can drag our return value into this. We'll set this back to 200. And then we'll take the return value from this and pipe it into our add node. Now we want to make sure that our scene component is parented to the camera. So we'll drag it onto first person camera, and then we'll rename this to something a little more descriptive. We'll call it the held object loc. Now we need to add the blueprints for being able to grab an object or pick it up and to drop it as well. And we also need to set up the input events. Let's start with our grab object node network. We're going to need our physics handle for this. So we'll drop it into the scene, and we're going to use grab component off of this one. So you pull off of the output and type grab component. And the actual name of the node is grab component at location. While we're at it, we might as well start setting up the release component as well. We'll grab our physics handle again from our component list, drag it into the scene. This time we're going to create a release component. And we can leave these here for now. We're going to go back up to our line trace. And off of here, we're going to pull out of the output of our line trace and go to a branch. We're going to use the out-hit output off of our line trace, and we're going to drag this to a break hit result. So this is going to get the result of our line trace if it hits something. From here, we'll grab from the hit component, and out of there, we're going to need to test if that component is simulating physics. So is simulating physics. Remember, we enabled simulating physics in our movable object. So our return value will tie into another branch. So the condition is testing whether or not the object is simulated. And then we'll tie the branch off of our line tracer into this branch as well, continuing the chain of our line trace. And finally here, we want to pull off of the return value of our line trace and put it into the condition of the first branch. Okay, we need to bring up our grab component. And so if the object is simulating and we've touched it with our line trace, we'll tie this into our grab component at location. We need to fill in the component input there, and we'll just bring that off of our hit component. So that would be the furniture that we're touching with the line trace. We'll grab that and pull it into the component input here. And next we need to get the grab location. So once again, we're going to pull off of the hit component, and we need to get the world location. So get world location. And in the return value of our world location, we'll go here into the grab location. Now we want to keep track of whether or not we're holding an object. Remember, we don't want to be able to pick up multiple objects. So we need to create a new variable. Under the variables category here on the left, we'll click new variable, and we'll call this B holding object. Now we can drag that variable into our blueprint here, and we're going to set it to set B holding object. And then off of our grab component, we'll tie that into the set holding object and make sure we check holding object. Now we also need to know when we've released the object, so we'll go back down to our release component. We'll pull the variable into the scene again, and this time using set B holding object, we'll uncheck holding object. We next need to add some input, so when the user or the viewer presses a key on the keyboard, he can pick the object up. So we'll go into our project settings and then go under Engine Input. And here we need to add a new action mapping, and we're going to call this Grab Object. We'll click on the drop down, we'll open up Keyboard, and we'll use the E key. So we'll scroll down till we can find E. Okay, so we need to jump back over to our blueprint. All right, so we're going to go ahead and add our E key in here. So we'll right click and choose E key, and that'll allow us to find the E key very quickly. Now we need a custom event, so we'll choose custom event. We're going to name this custom event pick up object. We need another custom event, and we'll name this one drop object. Pickup object, we want to tie that into our line tracer. So we'll go ahead and drag that up here to the line tracer and take the output into the input of the line tracer. So now our line tracer will only fire when the pickup object event happens. Now we want to take the drop object event and we want to tie that one into our release component node. So we'll drag it here and then from the output into the input of release component. So our release component will only happen once we have detected the drop object event. When we press the E key, this is where we're going to test for whether or not we're already holding an object. So we need our B holding object variable. So let's drop that into the scene. And in this case, we're going to do a get B holding object. So we'll need a branch to test whether or not we're holding the object when we press the E key. So pulling off of the pressed on E, we'll do a search for branch, drop that in. The condition, of course, is holding object. So if it's true, if we are holding an object, we want to fire off the drop object function. If it's false, we want to fire off the pick up object function. So now we know if we're holding the object to drop it, and if we're not holding it to pick it up. So now we need to be updating the location of our physics object every tick of the game. We're going to drag in our physics handle again. And we also need to drag in the held object location. Remember, this is the scene component that we created and added to our first-person camera, and this is where the object will be in front of us as we're holding it. So we'll need to set the target location of the object, so pulling off of the physics handle, we'll do a search for set target location. And for the location, we'll need to get the world location of that object. So we'll pull off of held object location and of course do a search for get world location. And then the return value just needs to go into our new location. Now we want this to happen every tick of the scene. So we're going to right click and we'll choose event tick. We're just going to pull off of the output of our event tick and tie it into the input of our set target location. So every tick of the scene as it's running in real time will be updating location of the held object. Okay, and that should be it. So we can go ahead and compile our scene. Looks like our compile was successful. So now let's give it a test. So let's look at our piece of furniture here and pick it up. There we go. We can pick it up now. It did kind of pick up funny. It's a little bit too jiggly and rotates as I move around. So we can fix that by tweaking a few settings on the object itself. You want your furniture to stay in the same rotation axis so that it'll be easy to put back down. So we're going to lock all axes here, X, Y, and Z. Let's go ahead and try that. All right, we'll pick up the furniture. So now we have a nice unrotating piece of furniture that we can move around the scene. It collides with everything else. And then let's see if we can drop it now. Perfect. There are many different ways we could have achieved similar results in Unreal. Blueprint is virtually limitless in the types of techniques you can use to do things. This particular technique I got off of the Unreal community, and that's a great example of how you can go into the wiki and the YouTube channels and find tons of information on how to do these things, not just from the Unreal developers and the people who work at Epic, but also from the community, which is huge. So a big thanks to the community for this technique. Being able to move things around is great, but what if we want our viewer to be able to change the paint color on the wall or choose a different pattern of hardwood flooring? Blueprint gives us that ability as well using material instances, and we'll cover that next. Before we can provide our intended viewer with a working real-time walkthrough, we need to make sure it's going to work flawlessly. The first tool at your disposal for debugging and testing your environment is the message log. If it's not already up, you'll find the message log under Window, Developer Tools, and then under Log. Here in the message log, you'll find all of the errors and warning messages you need to know about your scene. Under lighting results, we have a bunch of warnings. These yellow exclamation points indicate warnings, so they're not really errors, but they're things that you should probably look at fixing. Also, in the viewport, if we click the down arrow next to the word perspective here, first of all, we can enable the show FPS here. So if we turn that on, now we can see the frame rate for my scene. I'm running it at about 120 hertz or 120 frames per second. Each frame is taking about 8 milliseconds, which is great because this is even going to run on a VR headset. You'll also find an extensive array of stats under the stat menu here. If we'll go over to advanced or engine, you're going to find a ton of stuff here. So for instance, under Engine, I can use detailed stats, and this is going to give me a real-time graph of the stats, as well as over here telling me how many milliseconds everything is taking. There are also quite a few viewport visualizations to help us debug content. We of course have lit and unlit, but we also have the ability to go to wireframe mode. Wireframe mode is actually more helpful than you might think. This will allow you to debug the density of your meshes. Below this, we have our detail lighting, which shows us lighting and reflections and ambient occlusion. And below that, we can also diagnose just lighting, see what our lighting looks like without any of that extraneous information. Next, we have shader complexity. The cool thing about shader complexity is we have a little bar at the bottom here from good to extremely bad. So you can move around the scene. So most of my scene here is clearly in the good zone for shader complexity. Our materials are not overly complex until you get to these translucent objects, which have things like screen space reflections on them as well. And these are extremely costly objects here. So the last option on view mode is buffer visualizations, and there are a lot of options here to look at. We're not going to cover them all, but we'll look at a couple of them. First of all, we have material ambient occlusion, which we're not using any, but if you had any ambient occlusion maps inside of your materials, you would see them using this option. We also have metallic here, so we can see every metallic option in our scene. With metallic, we can see every material in our scene that has the metallic component applied to it. Likewise, we can see roughness. So these are all the roughness values of our scene. So here we can see the chrome sphere has a roughness value of 0 and the gray ball has a roughness value of 1. Under the show menu, we have a couple of interesting options. So we go down to show and then developer. we can enable gbuffer hints to get some idea of what our materials are doing. So with gbuffer hints, you can see the indicators up here say that yellow materials are unrealistic and they are 100% black, which you will never find in nature. So in this case, this oven here has a black component to the material, making it something we might want to tweak. You'll also find some options under the window menu. First of all, we have the statistics window, so we'll pull that up. Now in here, you have a lot of things that you can look at that are going to tell you about the amount of memory that's being taken up and a few other things. So for instance, we're in the light building info. This can be enabled when you go to your build settings drop down here. You can turn on show lighting stats and it will collect the information every time you do a light map bake. So we can see here we have lighting time, unmapped texels, unmapped texel memory, total texel memory, and these options here. So for lighting time, this is telling you how long each of these light maps is taking to be calculated. So if I sort this, we can see we've got some that are taking over 800 seconds to bake. If I click on the name here, this will take me to the asset. In this case, it's the floor, which I have a fairly high quality light map on that. As for unmapped texels, we can see here that this object has 96% unmapped texels. That means the light map itself is not being used efficiently. So the UV coordinates for the light map are not taking up enough of the space. So we'll probably want to go in and look at that light map and try to make corrections there. The drop down here allows us to get other information such as primitive stats. Under primitive stats, we can see things like poly counts as well as the amount of memory they're taking up. Then we also have a drop down for static mesh lighting information. And finally, texture stats. And texture stats is going to provide information like the size of the textures, the format, the amount of memory the textures take up, and so forth. Last of all, if we look under the build menu, we'll find a few more options. First of all, you know about show lighting stats. We showed that earlier. But we can also enable error coloring. So when we bake our light maps, it will colorize the light maps to let us know if there are any issues. So I think you'll find you're going to have a ton of options for debugging your content to make sure it runs the best that it can. After you've solved any content issues you have using these debugging tools, it's time to package up your walkthrough and deliver it. There are a few settings you'll want to take a look at though before you package it. You're going to find them all under your project settings. Most of them will be found here under project. First of all, let's go to maps and modes. Right now, this project is set to use the first person map that comes with the template, but we want to change that to make use of our Epic Interiors map. You'll find under default maps, we can change the editor startup map. And then we have the game default map, and this is the map that will launch when you create your distribution. So we'll change that as well. After this, you want to go to the packaging menu here. We really just want to change one of these options here, and that's build configuration. Right now it's set to development. We want to change that to shipping. Shipping is going to package up everything and cook everything so that it's going to run the fastest without any debugging tools built in or anything that can slow it down. Next up is supported platforms. And here you'll want to check only the platforms that your project supports. So right now it's set up for all platforms. I'm just going to disable that, and then we'll uncheck everything except for desktop and Windows. Below that we have targeted hardware. We want to make sure this is optimized for, in this case, desktop or console maximum quality. All right, so now that we have all our settings, we'll go ahead and save the project, and we're ready to build our package. For that, we'll simply go to File, Package Project, and choose the platform Windows, and in this case we're going to go with Windows 64-bit. I'm going to create a new folder here in my project and just call it distro. And now Unreal Studio will begin to package the project. Now you've got your real-time walkthrough. Fully tested and built, the last step is to send it off to the client. Congratulations on a job well done. Next up, we'll summarize the topics we've covered in this course, and I'll offer my final thoughts.